So my name is Cris Putnam. I'm the author of a book that I co-wrote with Tom Horn called Exo-Vaticana, which really covers these topics and a lot more. We speculate, kind of like Gans is doing, that perhaps some of this stuff that we see going on in space and these things with the UFO phenomenon and whatnot could be related to prophecy. I'm not married to that idea. I don't teach it like it's some kind of absolute thing. The thing that I find most compelling about it is that when you look at all the diversity in the world, all the different worldviews and different religions and things of that nature, it's hard to imagine how everyone could quickly come together under one leader or a one world religion. But when you think of something coming from space, something that transcends humanity, that transcends the Earth, that's the kind of thing that would unite everybody very quickly, okay, like overnight almost. So we could see this all fall into place very fast if this was, the impetus for it. And for that reason, I find it very compelling because, almost overnight, you could have the world come together either to defend ourselves or perhaps just to welcome, what purports to be some sort of alien presence. So for that reason, it's a powerful, it has a lot of explanatory scope for how prophecy could come together really fast. So that's really the main reason that I find it interesting. Also, some of the theology coming from the supposed UFO nauts or space brothers, and we discussed quite a bit of that. So this is the book, Exo-Vaticana, and I have those on the table. Be happy to sign them for you or anything like that. And this presentation I'm doing today is a little interesting. I've done one previously at other prophecy conferences, basically how this could all play into the Antichrist for the reasons I just gave, how it would bring the world together really quickly. But I was actually asked by MUFON in Los Angeles, which is the Mutual UFO Group. It's a group of people that investigate UFOs. It's a secular group, and most of them actually believe in aliens and things like that. They're not really Christians. But they were so interested in this book that they actually flew me from North Carolina to Los Angeles to speak to a MUFON group in Burbank. And so some of this presentation is really based on what I did for them. Because this science of astrobiology is something that's fascinating. Whether this plays into prophecy or not, it's really something that is beneficial to have some understanding of, because there's a lot of misinformation in the media right now that kind of leads people astray. And we're going to unpack some of that this morning. When we're talking about the Catholic connection, how did we get this crazy cover on the book of Exo-Vaticana with these UFOs over the Vatican? Did we just make that up to sell books or what? Well, actually, no. In 1978, it's really, for Catholics, it's kind of a famous year. It's known as the year of three popes. You had Pope Paul VI, he died. And then when he died, we had John Paul I, and he was only in office like 30 days, like 31 days, 33 days. And some people actually think he was murdered. There's a lot of conspiracy literature about that. We won't go into all of that. The book, Petrus Romanus, discusses some of that. But then John Paul II, the pope that many people probably remember, in my generation anyway, was elected. And he became pretty famous and well known. But so right in this little short period of time, we had three popes, which is kind of unprecedented, especially in the modern era. But what you might not know is that right during the same time is what they call a UFO flap, meaning that there was just a mass of UFO sightings over Rome right during the same time. Really interesting. So right during the midst of this brief pontificate of John Paul I, the one that lived 33 days, numerous cigar, disc, triangular-shaped craft were seen across the skies over Italy by people of all walks of life, including Vatican officials, police officers. Now here's a report from MUFON records. 5:50 a.m. on September 14th, people in Rome saw a triangular-shaped object for 5 minutes. About the same time, people near Florence seeing a cigar-shaped object. Early on the morning of the 16th, highway police near Rome received calls of a luminous triangle and a beam of greenish light. So you quickly see that the cover of our book is not something that we just made up. It's something that's actually based on the historical record. This is from the New York Times news service in 1978 in America. Okay, so this was a big enough deal, it made American newspapers. And the New York Times news service is not someone that's publishing stuff like, the National Enquirer. They don't just make up news stories. This was a real story. And there it is in the newspaper. So, dozens of people witnessed this, photographed it, a donut-shaped craft. Even more interesting, some fishermen went missing. Apparently, they were abducted out of their fishing boat. They disappeared. And honestly, I could not find anything about them ever showing back up. So I don't know if they were taken and never came back or what happened, but the story just ended there with them being missing, as far as I can tell. Now, is this connected to the three pope year? There's no way to prove that. Correlation does not equal causation, but it's suggestive. It's really interesting that you have this really charged period of time with one pope possibly being murdered at the same time all these UFOs are over Rome. Really, really interesting correlation there. Now, it's not just Tom Horn and other Christian authors who speculate about this could perhaps be related to the end times or the Vatican is really up to something. This is a book by secular ufologist. Richard Dolan is probably one of the premier ufologists right now. He's an academic historian. He teaches at a university, but he writes a lot of books about the UFO phenomenon. And here he is in his book, After Disclosure, meaning when the government discloses the truth about the aliens that a lot of people think they're suppressing, which is a debate in and of itself. But here, here's a quote from him: "The world's largest church seems to be positioning itself at the forefront of disclosure. The Vatican has long maintained several major astronomical observatories and a collection of radio telescopes. In recent years, its hierarchy has stated, in one form or another, that we have company. Perhaps they know something is afoot or suspect its inevitability." Well, there's a wealth of evidence that supports the idea that they expect its inevitability, and we're going to look at quite a bit of that this morning. So it's not just us. It's the community at large. People that look at this issue all recognize the Vatican really does seem to be up to something. They act like they know something, but they're not really being real specific about it. So do they know something we don't? Well, here's the reasons why I think we can conclude that they do. It's the oldest bureaucracy in existence. Okay, think about it. There is a lot of the Vatican. The Roman Catholic Church has their own mythology where they say they go back to the Apostle Peter. Well, I don't really buy that. Most of his history that they cite for that is probably not true. I think that you can really trace the Catholic Church as we know it today probably to around AD 500. But even there, we're still dealing with the oldest bureaucracy in history, really. There's nothing else that's been around that long that's still intact and has maintained records. So, if anyone would have records of weird stuff happening, going all the way back, it would be them. We have, 1,214 million followers, placed all over the world. And people in high levels of government, people in military, people in the intelligence agencies of all these different governments, they're Roman Catholics. And if you look at Catholic theology and what it means to accept their catechism and their beliefs, maybe not so much today as it was in the past, but part of that is that really your first allegiance is to the church and to the Pope, more so than your country or anything else. So if you're a agent for the United States, but you're Roman Catholic, really, technically, you're sworn to allegiance to the Pope before the United States. Now, did they take that seriously? I don't know, but technically, that they would be more inclined, to spin things to the will of the Vatican than they would for their own country. That's what it says on paper. That's what they agree to. That the Pope is really the supreme leader. Really, in Catholic theology, the Pope is Christ on earth. The vicar of Christ technically means instead of Christ. He is here as Christ on earth. And that's really what that means. And that's why so many Protestants in the past would have said the Pope was the Antichrist, because that Greek prefix anti also means instead of. Okay, so it technically, vicar of Christ could be translated Antichrist. And so you have all these insiders. And then you have all these secret societies, the Jesuits, the Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, Knights of Columbus. So you have all these little organizations with their own secrets and their own little agendas, within all these countries. So with all this global infrastructure, they also have an interest in astronomy, and they have observatories, and so we're going to unpack that. But these things are all very suggestive. That we know that they do special investigations into supernatural phenomenon. You have the miracles that they investigate, the apparitions. They go to places where people claim to see Mary, and they investigate. They do exorcisms. So they have a vested interest in this. They have people all over the world. It's part of their job to investigate anomalies and weird phenomenon. So it really follows that they would have records about strange things seen in the sky, strange beings that might appear in certain areas that would go back thousands of years. So I think it's safe to conclude that they do have some information that they're not letting the rest of us in on. One of the big ones is this thing, the Fatima Miracle of the Sun. A lot of people have heard about the Fatima prophecies, right? Have you ever heard of that? The third secret of Fatima is a big controversial thing that gets talked about. Now, what this was really there was 3 children who said that they saw Mary, like a Marian apparition type thing, and that Mary was talking to them. And this was in Fatima, Portugal, in the early 20th century. So these children told their town that Mary was going to do this big miracle on a certain day in October of 1917. And so all these people show up, and they see what they call the miracle of the sun. Now, what's the miracle of the sun? Well, they're all standing out in this field, and if you listen to the reports, and we're going to read some testimony, the official version is that the sun actually moved around in the sky, okay? The physical sun, and that a cascade of colors came down, and all this weird stuff happened, the rain stopped. But you see a field full of people looking up. This is actual newspaper from 1917. So something real happened. And I don't believe it was the sun moving in the sky, and we'll talk about why. But something very real did happen, and these people did see something moving around in the sky. I think it technically meets the definition of a UFO. UFO means unidentified flying object, okay? I don't think it's the sun, but something was moving in the sky. So here's the picture of the crowd in 1917. So this made all the papers. There's different estimates. Some people will say 20,000. Some will say up to almost 80,000 or something like that. I think it's probably the lower side of those numbers. But it's a really interesting phenomenon because you had so many witnesses, and it was covered in newspapers. And it's a really big part of Catholic theology. All the popes believe it now. Pope John Paul II believed that it was a prophecy about his attempted assassination and that Mary stopped the bullet. And if you read his testimony on that, that's what he thought. So here's what some of the people at the time were saying that this Fatima event happened. In a book called Heavenly Lights, and it's about apparitions and the Fatima thing it's a Portuguese scholar, Joaquim Fernandez, and he got all these testimonies from the time period. And here's one: suddenly a luminous disk the size of a great host, but one to be gazed upon as one gazes on the moon, appeared as it stood out from the sun. So you see people testifying in a way that it sounds like there was a disk that kind of came from the general vicinity of the sun, but it wasn't the sun itself, okay? So when you see words like disk in the sky, okay, we think flying saucer, UFO, right? But in 1917, that word wasn't even in the vocabulary. The flying saucer didn't enter our vocabulary until the 1940s, when Kenneth Arnold cited one, and the newspapers called it a flying saucer. So nobody was thinking about UFOs or spacecraft or disks in the sky in 1917, so they kind of would parse that as a natural phenomenon. They thought it was the sun, they said. Here's another testimony from someone, an engineer. And you can see he describes it as a disk of polished glass illuminated from behind, or a majestic disk. You can see the vocabulary in here of it. It's all speaking of what I would probably call a flying saucer, a disk in the sky. And here's another testimony. Again, the sun is described as a silver disk. Here's another one. The sun gave the appearance of a globe of dull silver fire surrounded by a dark purplish disk. So I could keep citing this sort of testimony from eyewitnesses of the period. But I think the point is pretty clear. The official version of the story, that the sun was moving in the sky, was really packaged in Catholic religious terminology and the dogma of the day. But based on these descriptions from the witnesses, I think it's pretty safe to say that it really is some sort of UFO. Now, why would I say that I don't think it's the sun? Well, here's the only known photograph that I'm aware of that supposedly captures this thing. And if you can see, there's a dull gray globe over on this side. I think I have a close-up right there. Okay, that's not the sun. The sun is a huge disk of plasma, of fire. It's really bright. It doesn't look dark. Okay, so there's something going on there. That's not the sun. Now, just logically, if we think about what the sun is, it's a huge, massive star that the Earth rotates around, right? If the sun were to move, the whole solar system would be thrown into chaos. It would kill everybody on Earth, okay? We would all be dead. And so it's not the sun dancing in the sky. Plus, no one saw it outside of this field in Fatima, Portugal. If the sun moved, the whole world would know it, wouldn't they? Of course. So the official Catholic version can't be true. It just cannot be true. It doesn't make any sense. Now, Jacques Vallee is a PhD computer scientist, and he has a master's degree in astronomy. He's also one of the most prolific authors on the UFO phenomenon. And he's studied this, and he wrote a book with several other scholars, and Eric Davis was one, but they have a book called Fatima Revisited that came out in 2008. And, they really parse this as a UFO phenomenon. And some people say up to 70,000 witnesses saw it, but the idea is, Vallee's hypothesis on what UFOs are is that they're not aliens. He thinks that they're really some kind of interdimensional beings that are trying to steer people's belief systems by just doing weird stuff at different points in history. Now, when we think about what our worldview says, okay, last night I quoted that passage from Ephesians 6 that said we don't wrestle with flesh and blood, but powers and principalities. And then I cited a verse from Colossians that said that the philosophies of the world were being put on us by the elemental spirits of the world, the stoicheia. And that Greek word kind of means what we would call demonic spirits. So you get this idea that there are these spiritual forces behind world events that are steering things, trying to influence people's worldviews and their beliefs. Really the same sort of thing that the secular UFO researcher, he's not a Christian by any means, he's saying the UFO phenomenon is doing that. And that it appears at certain times in history and does these weird events like this Fatima thing, trying to steer people towards certain belief systems. Really interesting that the way that meshes. I find that to be very suggestive. So, do they know something we don't? We're back to that outline. From Fatima, it's really interesting that we have a Pope, Pope Pius XII, who saw the same sort of thing over the Vatican gardens in Rome in 1950. Okay, so we're jumping from 1917 to 1950. Now, why is this interesting? Well, like I said, in Catholic theology, they do investigate these things, and then they vote in the popes, and they decide, is this an authentic apparition? Is this an authentic supernatural phenomenon? Should the church endorse it? So you have some apparitions that are, officially endorsed by the church. You have others that aren't, and there's controversy, and some Catholics believe this one and some don't. But the ones that the popes endorse, really all Catholics are bound to believe it. Okay, it's something that you don't really have a choice about believing because the Pope, the infallible vicar of Christ, has endorsed it. Okay, well, Pope Pius XII was the Pope that endorsed the Fatima miracle of the sun. He's the one that made that an official miracle that Catholics are bound to believe. But more interesting, people aren't aware that a lot of these Catholic doctrines that they have been evolving since the Middle Ages. Some of them are new. Now, one of the ones that's relatively recent, he promulgated this in the 1950s, right when this was going on. He was thinking about should I promulgate this doctrine? It was called the Assumption of Mary. This is the idea that Mary was taken up to heaven just like Jesus in the beginning of the book of Acts or at the end of Luke's gospel. Jesus goes up to heaven. Well, Catholics hold that that happened to Mary too, that she was taken up to heaven. Well, this was something that some Catholics believed, others didn't. It was controversial. He's thinking about making that an official dogma that every Catholic is bound to believe. Now, he's debating this in his mind. He's written up the papers. He's not sure if he's going to do it or not. Then that morning, he's out at the Vatican gardens praying, thinking about it. He sees this gray silver disc in the sky above the Vatican gardens, okay? The same thing that happened in Fatima. He takes that as a sign that he's supposed to do it, so he does, okay? So quite literally, you could argue that a UFO dictated an official Catholic dogma that all Catholics are bound to believe, because that's really what inspired him to do it. And we have a handwritten note in his own handwriting where he said that. So it's not just a speculation. That note is even available online. You can find it, and it's linked in my book, Exo-Vaticana. So here we have a Pope, Pope Pius XII, who actually saw the same thing, many years later, and it inspired him to promulgate a doctrine. So here is a little snippet from that note that he wrote describing what he saw. It moves slightly, either spinning or moving from the left to the right and vice versa, but within the sphere you could see a marked movement, of total clarity and without interruption. So there it is, and that whole note is available. Now, I find it really interesting that, how does this get associated with Mary? What does Mary have to do with a gray disc floating around in the sky? I just don't see that. If you're familiar with the UFO phenomenon, a lot of these people claim that they're in touch with aliens. Now, do they ever physically meet the aliens? Most of them don't. What you find is you have this thing called channeling that a lot of New Agers do. And it's almost like they're allowing themselves to be possessed. It's not almost like, it is like that. It is what they're doing. They kind of go into a trance, and then this other being speaks through them. Okay, well, that's the same thing that happens with this Marian phenomenon. Those 3 kids in the field, nobody saw Mary. One little girl went into a trance and started speaking for Mary. And the prophecies, the Fatima prophecies, all came from like this 12-year-old girl, 11-year-old girl, something like that. And so, there's no actual contact with Mary other than channeling. It's the same thing UFO people do. If you go out and listen to a New Age channeler in California, it's the same phenomenon. And sociologists have actually compared the Marian apparition phenomenon to this channeling phenomenon. There's no difference. It's exactly the same sort of thing. They go into a trance, and then someone else takes over their voice and starts speaking. So that's what's going on with the Marian thing, and that's where these prophecies that the Catholics are so enamored with are coming from. It's coming from channeling, and usually from young, impressionable children. Now, you could argue that they're innocent, and that's why Mary chooses them. That's kind of what the Catholics say. I would say it's because they don't have any discernment. They're 10 years old, and it's easy to fool them. And I tend to think that's probably a more likely explanation for that. So here we are. Do they know something we don't know? So after Pope Pius XII, we have the Vatican Observatory Research Group, VORG. And I had a little fun with that acronym. Vatican Observatory Research Group, because it sounds like the Borg, if you ever watched the Star Trek series. You will be assimilated. And it's no secret that the Vatican is really interested in life in space. In 2009, they had an astrobiology conference in Rome. And we'll talk about what astrobiology is, but it's the study of life in space, right? Astronomy, biology, space, life, put the two together, study of life in space. Now, do we know about any life in space? Can anybody think of any life in space that's been discovered yet? I can't think of any. But isn't it interesting? You can get a PhD in this science that technically has nothing to study. That's a really interesting thing, isn't it? So it's really based on a lot of atheistic type assumptions, and I'm going to unpack that. But here we have the Vatican Observatory. They sponsored this conference where they invited the top astrobiologists in the world. A lot of not Catholics. We're talking about atheists and Buddhists and everybody that's involved in astrobiology. Okay, the video is not playing. Let's see, what do? I should be able to click on the video. Let me see if I can get this going. Here we go.
For the Church, talking about life on other planets is not an everyday occurrence. But that was the theme at a week-long meeting that gathered scientists and theologians in the Vatican. The purpose of the meeting centered around astrobiology and the possibility that life exists elsewhere in the universe.
So just a quick little snippet to show you that I'm not just making that up. Here we have, articles on the internet. Vatican prepares for extraterrestrial disclosure. So a lot of people are speculating about all this. Why are they having astrobiology conferences in Rome? Sponsored by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. It's a really interesting thing going on there. That was in 2009, and Dr. Cris Putnam, he is a cosmologist and astrobiology education outreach designate for the University of Arizona, which is really near where their observatory is. He gave the keynote speech in Rome in 2009, and this is a little snip of what he said. It is plausibly estimated that there are hundreds of millions of habitable locations in the Milky Way, which is just one of billions of galaxies in the universe. As scientists gather to discuss the possible progress in astrobiology, we still know of only one planet with life, our own, but there is palpable expectation that the universe harbors life, and there is hope that the first discovery is only a few years away. Okay, that was in 2009, which would make that like now, right? So what was Dr. Putnam talking about? And he's an interesting character as well. I think he's kind of a Buddhist, really associated with Catholics, so it's really interesting how that works together. But I think that what he was speaking of when he thought that they would discover something in a few years are these exoplanets. And that's just a big word that means a planet outside of our solar system. So any planet outside of our solar system. There's so many of those that they're discovering due to the Kepler space satellite that they expect that they're just going to find the right one and that it will harbor life. And I think in 2009 he thought that by now we would have found one that we could prove had life on it. I'm not aware that they have done that, but they're trying. So that was in 2009, and here are these exoplanets I'm talking about. And this is a chart of what they call current potentially habitable exoplanets. Okay, so those few years are upon us, and these discoveries seem to offer some promise. And if you just read some of the media articles, it's a little misleading. But it is interesting that prior to 1995, we had no evidence of any planets outside of our solar system. We didn't know of a single one, okay? Because they're so far away. But this has changed dramatically. I mean, they now estimate that there are billions of them, okay, throughout the universe. And I don't have a problem with that. Right now, it's probably around 1,800 that they've cataloged, that they've got listed, something like that. And that number changes daily because they're discovering them very fast with the space satellites they have now. So that's a remarkable progress. As with the time that I did this presentation a few months ago, only 12 were classified habitable. That's probably changed since then. But this adjective, habitable or Earth-like, it's really misleading. And so this is one of the first things I want to unpack for you so you can help to maybe talk to your friends and neighbors and have a better understanding of what they're meaning when they say that. They don't know that this planet is habitable or Earth-like. That's a misnomer. What they're saying really is that the planet is within an Earth comparable distance from its star. Okay, so the Earth is a certain distance from the sun, right? And that gives us the right temperature, so it's not too hot, not too cold. They call it the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold for what? Mainly the existence of liquid water, okay? Which is, we know, an essential ingredient for life. So really what the idea here is, if it's not too cold, not too hot that the water vaporizes, not so cold that it freezes, and there's liquid water, that makes it possible for life to exist. And that's all but they don't even know that the water's there. All they're looking at is the distance from the star. It's an Earth comparable distance. And if it's the right distance, they say it's habitable. That's all they know, okay? And so they've never seen it. They don't know if water's there. They don't know any of this stuff. They're just basing that on the distance from its sun, and that's really all it means. It's just that an Earth-comparable distance from its star. And, that's important, but it's certainly not, it's what we would say, it's a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. That distance is necessary for life, but it's not sufficient for life, okay? So here's an artist's conception. So these photos that I'm showing you, none of them are actually photographs of the planet. They've never seen most of these planets. Maybe one or two that they can pick up with a telescope, but they're so far away, and these planets are so dark compared to the stars near them, you can't really see them with a telescope because the starlight will actually blind the telescope from seeing these dark little planets. So really they're detecting them through various means, and we're going to talk about how that works in a minute. But you see all these pictures in the newspapers and magazines that make you think that they've actually seen the planet and they know what it looks like. They don't. So this is one that they would say is habitable, and they call it Kepler 62e. It's like 1.6 times the size of our Earth. It's in the habitable zone of its star, so it could have liquid water. And it's the star that it orbits is actually cooler than ours, than our sun, so the planet itself is closer to make up for that, right? So it's almost at a Mercury distance from its star. So a year on this planet is 122 days. Okay, so it does a full cycle in 122 days. So, so they do modeling studies and all these kind of mathematical extrapolations, and they say, well, it would have a damp, warm environment. And they're just speculating. And so they would say that perhaps it's covered with water, and it's all guesswork, okay? But with this one, for a long time, it was the one that everyone thought could have life. But then the modeling study said, well, if it does have water, it would be completely covered with water. So it would just be a water planet. Now, that would make civilization as we know it kind of hard to happen, wouldn't it? It would all be fish. Okay. Unless it's a planet full of mermaids and mermen, I don't see it happening. I don't think they're sending flying saucers here. So how do they detect these planets? I told you they were really just detecting them. Well, one of the main methods they use, it's called the transit method. So what they're doing is they detect the star crossing the path of its sun. And it's really, so they look at the star, and when something passes in front of it, it dims it a little bit, just a tiny bit. But they have really sensitive instruments, and so they can tell when a small planet crosses in front of the star that the light goes down a little bit. And so you see this graph, you see the light, it dips down, dips down. And if it does that on a regular basis, they know something's orbiting it, okay? They just pick this little dip in the light. And so they know that something's orbiting. And then, through physics and Newton's equations and things like that, they can detect the mass and all kinds of things. So this is one of the main methods, just by watching the star blink a little bit. Okay, and that shows that something's orbiting it. So that's one of the main ways. So they haven't seen a planet. They don't really know what it looks like. They just know that the star blinks, okay? Now here's another method. It's called the Wobble Method. Now, you're probably familiar with the Doppler effect with sound. Like a siren goes by and you hear the pitch change as it gets distant. You know what I'm talking about? How the sound, it's the Doppler effect is what we call it. That works with light as well. Okay, so one of the ways that they see it, they see a shift in the light frequency that tells them that the star is moving. And then the gravitational wobble. With this one, they can see when something orbits our sun, it doesn't just cause the Earth to move, it actually causes the sun to move a little bit. So when something massive is orbiting a star, it causes the star to wobble, and they can detect that wobble. So that's another way that they can tell that something is orbiting a star. Here's another artist's rendition. This is Kepler 62f, and then 62e, the one we looked at before, is that bright spot off to the side. Now this one it's a little further away from its sun, so for it to even have a temperature suitable for life, it would have to have a really strong greenhouse gas type effect with plenty of carbon dioxide to keep it warm. To even have an ocean. Otherwise, it would just be an ice-covered snowball. So this is another one that you might hear about that could be habitable, but they really don't know that. And there's a good chance that it's an ice ball. Now, just recently, in the last 6 months or so, they came out with this one, Kepler 186f. And they think that this is like the definitive Earth-like planet. And there was all kinds of media speculation about this one. The same sort of thing, but it does, the thing that makes this one a little different is that it's not what they call a hot Jupiter, or it's really an Earth-like size to it. It's one of the first ones they found that's close to the same size as our Earth. But again, there's no evidence that it actually has water or any life or any of these things. It's just in an optimal location in its orbit. So why do these scientists jump to these conclusions that these planets could have life? Why do they use this vocabulary, Earth-like or habitable? Where is that coming from? Well, it's really based on their assumptions. And I'm going to unpack those. This is probably one of the most important parts of understanding this presentation and understanding astrobiology and where these guys are coming from. Our society, and I talked about a little of this last night, we live in Western culture. We've really made scientists into the ultimate arbiters of truth. They really are the guys that are in charge of telling us what's true and what's not. And it kind of results in this idea called scientism. And what that means is that science is the only avenue to truth. The scientific method is the only way to arrive at truth. Now, it's a really popular notion, and you'll see a lot of the new atheists and people like that kind of forcing this down your throat, that the only way you can really know if something's true is you have to do it by science. But let's unpack that idea. Was the idea of scientism arrived at by the scientific method? Did they come to the truth that the only way you can find truth is through the scientific method? Was that truth arrived at by the scientific method? No, it wasn't, was it? You can't do experiments to prove that. They didn't, try to falsify their hypothesis to get to that, did they? No, so it actually commits suicide. It doesn't meet its own standard, right? That truth was not arrived at by science. So if it's true, it's false. So yeah, scientism is a self-refuting idea, okay? And so that's an easy one to come back with if an atheist ever throws that at you. Now the next assumption is really based on the Copernican revolution. And this was when Copernican theory displaced geocentrism, the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe and that everything revolved around the Earth, which was, started with the pagans, with Aristotle. And it was really what everyone believed up until, Copernican theory took over. Now, the thing about the Copernican revolution is it displaced the Earth from the center of the universe, and it led to something a little more broad called the Copernican Principle. Now, this is kind of an extrapolation from that, saying that the Earth is not located in a special place in the universe. Okay, there's nothing special about the location of the Earth. Now, that's not too controversial, but there's some scientists that would disagree, and there's some intelligent design material that would refute that idea, I think. But it's really led to another conclusion that they call the Principle of Mediocrity. Now, this really undergirds most of astronomy now in the secular world, and especially astrobiology. Not only are we not in a special place in the universe, we're just a mediocre planet. There's nothing special about the Earth, period. And in fact, there's nothing special about life on the Earth. We're just one mediocre example of perhaps millions of other planets that are just like the Earth. Okay? So this is the Principle of Mediocrity, and these kind of things extrapolate one from the other. We're not in a special place, we're not in a special location, there's nothing special about the Earth. And then from there, we're just evolved primates, there's nothing special about humans, okay? So we're just a mediocre example of what could be one of millions of other life forms. Okay, so this is really one of the foundational assumptions of astrobiology, that the Earth is mediocre. Now you add the abiogenesis, which is the idea that life can come from non-life. No one has ever proved this, but it's necessary if you're an atheist. Something has to get it started, right? They've never been able to prove it, but they believe that somehow a chemical reaction occurred that started the first life, and then we have Darwinian evolution, and the Earth is populated with life forms. So you have to assume that as well to have life on these other planets based on their worldview. So, and then from there, humans are not special, we're just evolved pond scum. And then extraterrestrial life is inevitable, okay? So you really have to have all of these to assume that these other planets have life. This is kind of the way the thinking works. All right, so these are all assumed, and most of them are far from proven. So this is the worldview that's behind astrobiology. This was what fuels this line of thinking. And so that we have things like the SETI program, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And then, in 2014, they went to Congress and gave a speech asking for funding, saying, it would just be really bizarre if we're alone in the universe. There's so many planets out there. So, Congress is funding them. If you just heard recently, they put that little probe on a comet. Just two or 3 days ago, it landed and attached itself to a comet. We have a little space probe that is actually attached to a comet flying around in space now. Some of the missions that little probe are doing are for SETI, for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. They're actually going to use that to look for alien life in the universe. So now here is, I think, a good rejoinder, and I don't have time to unpack it a lot, but these are 2 astrobiologists. These guys are secular guys, Peter Brownlee and Donald Brownlee, I'm sorry, and Peter Ward. Peter Ward's a paleontologist, and Brownlee is an astronomer and astrobiologist. But these guys are not, trying to argue from a creationist point of view or intelligent design point of view. They're secular, but they really think that the Earth is special, and this principle of mediocrity is false. And this is a really academic science type of book, but they really catalog really well a lot of aspects of Earth that are not accounted for by these astrobiologists. I'm just going to tell you about a few of them. Point 1 is that our Earth really has to be in the right part of the galaxy, okay? So there is something special about where we are. There's a lot of parts of our galaxy that astronomers call dead zones, and there's so much gamma radiation and things like that, there's no possible way that life could ever exist in these zones. So you have to be in the right part of the galaxy. The second point is what we talked about, the Goldilocks zone. You have to be within a certain distance from the star to have liquid water. Third, any life-supporting system, it has to be structured much like our solar system, with small rocky inner planets and then the outer gas giants. Okay, and that's really important. You might not think about it, but Jupiter, if Jupiter wasn't there, we wouldn't be here. Why do I say that? Because there's so much rocks and debris in space. Jupiter is massive, it's huge, right? Its gravity sucks most of that in, and most of it hits Jupiter, and it doesn't come this far. Okay, if Jupiter wasn't there, we'd be bombarded by meteors. We'd be just bombarded out of existence. Fourth, for stable orbits, it really rules out systems with these large planets that are close to their sun. And a lot of the ones that we find, these exoplanets, they call them hot Jupiters. They're really hot gas giants, and they're close to their sun. And so it wouldn't give a stable orbit for the rest of the planets. It would kind of make the whole thing wobbly. So our solar system does reflect an optimal design that gives stable orbits. And you need a stable orbit to have stable seasons, stable temperatures, to maintain life as we know it. And it has to be of the right size. If our planet was a lot bigger, gravity would be so strong it would probably kill us. I don't think we could live on Jupiter, for instance, because the gravity is so powerful. So the planet has to be an optimal size, or our biology wouldn't function. Okay, the gravity would basically make it impossible. And it has to have a large moon. Now, the same thing I said about Jupiter is true of our moon. You look at all those craters on the moon, right? It looks like it's just been bombarded over and over again. Well, if it wasn't there, all those big craters would be on the Earth, wouldn't they? So the moon is like a little shield that's out there, sucking a lot of the debris in and preventing it from hitting the Earth. So it really is our protector in a lot of ways. So you really need that to have life, to exist as long as it has on Earth without it being completely wiped out by a meteor crash. And plate tectonics. This is where the Earth's crust moves. It causes our earthquakes. We have fault lines. But what we found out is that this is hugely important for our atmosphere and other things that really are essential to life. Carbon-based life, we need certain elements. We need certain aspects. Plate tectonics, a lot of these scientists that wrote this book, the Rare Earth Hypothesis, really think that this might be one of the most important requirements for life on our planet. It keeps us supplied with water. It provides a lot of the chemical elements that are necessary for life that wouldn't otherwise be here. And we don't know of any other planet in existence that has plate tectonics like the Earth does. There's something really weird about the Earth. None of the other planets we've ever observed have that, okay? And so that's something that's extremely unique about the Earth. And these points are coming from a secular scientist, but they really refute this principle of mediocrity that the astrobiologists are using as an assumption. And then abiogenesis and evolution, of course, there's a wealth of material out there refuting that. The idea that life came from non-life, there's absolutely no evidence for that whatsoever, and even most honest atheists will admit that. This idea of abiogenesis, it's really the biggest mystery for secular science. And Richard Dawkins, the author of The God Delusion, probably our most notorious atheist right now, this is something that he wrote. As far as we know, it may have happened only on one planet out of a billion planets in the universe. Of course, many people think that it actually happened on lots of other planets, but we only have evidence that it happened on one planet. After a lapse of 500 million to 1 billion years, right? So the sort of lucky event that we are looking for can be so wildly improbable that the chances of it happening somewhere in the universe could be as low as 1 in a billion in any 1 year. So how's the universe teeming with life again? So here's somebody that obviously doesn't share our worldview that's telling us that it would be nearly impossible for this to happen. But we know it happened here. And why do we know that? Because we're here. That's the logic. And it couldn't be God. No, we can't have that. So this is really a really shaky, tenuous assumption that's necessary to reach these conclusions that astrobiologists are coming to. Now, they know that. Francis Crick is a Nobel Prize-winning co-discoverer of the double helix structure of the DNA molecule. And interestingly, in the 1960s, he came up with this, here's the first quote. An honest man armed with the knowledge available to us today could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which we'd have to get it satisfied to get it going. So here we have, an atheist, Darwinist, Nobel Prize-winning scientist telling us that it's a miracle. Isn't that what we've been saying all along? So he knew that. He knows that, right? So he comes up with the theory of directed panspermia. What does that mean? Well, life started on Earth as a result of an infection by a microorganism sent here deliberately by a technological society on another planet by means of a special long-range unmanned spaceship. So he actually wrote, this is in a peer-reviewed science journal, okay? It's a serious science, this theory of panspermia. There's directed panspermia and undirected panspermia. Directed would be sent here by intelligent aliens. Undirected would be a virus inside a meteorite that started life on Earth. So have they really solved the problem of the origin of life? No, they just pushed it out onto some other planet and avoided it, right? Where did the aliens evolve from, right? They haven't answered that at all. So this is a really popular notion. And it's been in a lot of movies in Hollywood. Mission to Mars, this idea that life on Earth was seeded from space. Knowing in 2009 included this idea. Recently, Prometheus came out, same idea. Now here's one I found the most interesting. In this movie, Expelled, it's a movie a documentary about intelligent design and how scientists in universities who believe in intelligent design and offer up scientific theories based on intelligent design are being kicked out of their jobs. They're the ones that are being expelled because we can't allow this stuff in our schools because people might actually believe in God or something. So what the atheists and these secularists will say is that we're using a God of the gaps argument, that we look at science and we see a hole, like they can't explain the origin of life, so there's a gap there and we put God in the gap. Okay, so that's what they'll accuse you of. If you say, well, you can't explain this, so I know that God did it, they'll say, you're just using a God of the gaps argument. And this is their comeback. Well, I think they're making an aliens of the gaps argument. And so does Ben Stein. And here's a little segment from the movie, just a little short
Well, then who did create
clip. Oh.
the heavens and the earth?
Why do you use the word who? You see, you immediately beg the question by using the word who.
Well, then how did it get created?
Well, by a very slow process.
Well, how did it start?
Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
And what was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, and how did that happen?
I told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anybody.
Nor has anyone else. What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe.
Well,
but that higher intelligence would itself have had to have come about by some explicable or ultimately explicable process. It couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That's the point.
So Professor Dawkins was not against intelligent design, just certain types of designers, such as God.
So you can see this idea of panspermia is really popular with these secular atheistic scientists because they know they have nothing when it comes to the origin of life. So they're searching for something, and they don't want to believe in God, so they put it on aliens. So they're making an aliens of the gaps argument. Okay, it's the same thing they're accusing us of. They just replaced God with aliens. All right. Now, Dr. Michael Heiser, he's really a Semitic scholar. He's got his PhD in Hebrew Bible. He's the academic editor of Logos Bible software. He was actually my Old Testament professor in seminary, and I've studied with him privately at his own institute called the Memra Institute. He's really an ancient languages scholar who studies the biblical text, and he's a Christian and a theologian as well. And he's also really interested in UFOs and the subjects that we're talking about right now. And Mike wrote an essay on panspermia in a book that Tom Horn published. And he was speculating that this panspermia idea could really be the impetus for a one-world religion. And here's the quote from Mike. He said, "It paves the way for a true merging of science and religion. It will be the paradigm that allows the atheist to tolerate religion and allows literalist Bible readers, the Eastern Buddhist, and the pagan to simultaneously parse the new science the same way. This might in turn be useful fodder for a global religion." Okay? So interestingly, the impetus toward globalism that we see in our society right now is one of the reasons that ufologists, when they look at, why is it so unpopular to talk about UFOs in academia? Because people are obviously seeing things, there's something going on, but if you talk about that in a university, you get branded as a nut. Why is that? It's because they don't understand it, and there's kind of a taboo on that. But, when you look at that, it's the same sort of thing that you're seeing with this idea of panspermia, but once, if they offer some kind of evidence for panspermia, it can quickly be extrapolated into belief in aliens. It could be extrapolated into all sorts of things, but it sort of undergirds a lot of worldviews, And they could parse that in a way that appeals to everyone. And that's really what he's talking about. It would kind of make the ancient astronaut theory people who believed that the pyramids were helped constructed by aliens, it would support their worldview. It would support the Richard Dawkins worldview. And then they would come and tell Christians, well, the people that wrote the Bible, they just kind of misunderstood these advanced aliens as gods, and they thought they were angels and God, but really it was this, And so it's a satisfactory explanation in a sense to everyone, and it really could undergird a global religious idea, and that's what Mike's talking about. And I think it has a lot of explanatory power. Mike also said, any discernible obstacle to articulating a global religion that honors the cosmologies of all faiths, united as they are under the reality of panspermia and an extraterrestrial influence. So what he's saying is, they could explain everything to everyone in terms of extraterrestrials if science starts pulling up what they call life, evidence that life on Earth was seeded from space. And they're really looking hard at that right now, and there are a lot of people that believe it. And I suspect that that idea could be used the way Mike is saying. And Mike's a really smart guy, so when he says things like that, I pay attention. Interestingly, in researching Exo-Vaticana, I went and dug up everything I could find. This is a Catholic astronomer, Kenneth J. Dolan. This is a book from the 1970s, okay? It's officially approved Catholic literature. It was stamped twice where it's been approved. It doesn't violate any Catholic doctrine. It's got the final approval from the bishop of the diocese where it was published. And here's a quote from Dolan. Our religious sensitivities ought not be shocked by the idea that the evolutionary history of the human body might be traced back ultimately to a primordial refuse heap left by visiting extraterrestrial intelligence when the Earth was young. Okay? So in other words, we evolved from alien garbage. Okay? And this doesn't contradict Catholic doctrine. Interesting, huh? And that was in the 70s. That was in the 70s, all right? And so this has been going on for a while. This has been developing within the Roman Catholic faith for quite a while, and it's a very acceptable and approved idea, okay? It's not something that we're making up and saying they believe. It's something that they've believed for a long time. And here's a picture of the Vatican Advanced Technologies Telescope. Now, I took that photo of myself when Tom Horn and I visited this facility. And there's me and Tom right in front of it. It's the same jacket. Here's the sub-millimeter radio telescope. It's right over to the side. They have a big radio dish up there on top of Mount Graham in Arizona. And this is me standing in about the same place. In the distance, you see the Large Binocular Telescope. That's the most powerful telescope in the world. They told us that the images they can get from that telescope are actually more detailed and clearer than the Hubble Space Telescope, okay? It's got some huge mirrors, and mirror size is really what dictates the power of a telescope. And it's the largest mirrors in the world right now, and this is us walking toward it. This is the two mirrors that you see. This is at nighttime when it's open. It's called binocular because it has the two mirrors. And the reason they can get such clear images is by using two mirrors, they can move them like this and adjust for the lensing effect of the atmosphere and make it go away. So basically, it's just like it's in space. They can actually adjust it the way you would focus binoculars or something like that. So this is on their own website. The key science objective is to survey nearby stars for debris disks down to the levels that may obscure detection of Earth-like planets. So it's completely legitimate to say that the Vatican is up on top of Mount Graham in Arizona with the world's most powerful telescope looking for aliens. And they actually have a device on the Large Binocular Telescope that's acronymed LUCIFER. And that's really, it's a strained acronym. It stands for Large Binocular Telescope Near Infrared Spectroscopic Utility with Camera and Integral Field Unit for Extragalactic Research. Okay, and they shoehorned that into the acronym LUCIFER. It really sounds like somebody wanted to use LUCIFER and they just made it that way, doesn't it? And I did some research into that, and several people did, trying to find out how they came up with that. This large binocular telescope is actually owned by a big conglomeration. It's so expensive. I think it's like $36 million. So it's not a Catholic thing exclusively. There's a lot of universities involved. One of the big organizations in Germany is the Max Planck Institute, which really goes all the way back to Nazi Germany, but it's a really heavy physics institute in Germany. And it looks to me like they probably are the ones that came up with this. The German politician who got the funding for them to get involved, his name is, what is it? It's Tellel? Okay, it's Teufel in German, Teufel. It was his last name. So it's like Mr. Teufel. But in English, that would translate to devil. The word so yeah, there's a politician named Devil in Germany. And they think that because he's the one that got the money for them to get involved, that to honor him, they call it Lucifer. Okay, so that's probably where it came from. So I don't want to just pin that on the Jesuits or something like that. So I think the Germans named it named it Lucifer from Mr. Teufel. So here we have this year, 2014, March 16th, not too long ago, they had their second astrobiology conference. So here we have the Catholic Pontifical Academy of Sciences sponsoring another one, this time in Arizona. And the top astrobiologists in the world all come to the University of Arizona, sponsored by the Vatican again. Now here's astronaut Gordon Cooper. Really interesting quote. Do you want to know about UFOs and little green men? Contact the Vatican. Couldn't resist putting that one in there. I'm not sure if Gordon Cooper knows something we don't know or not, but he definitely is an American hero and an astronaut. And he's come out on the record as having seen flying saucers, and you can find him on the internet talking about it. He definitely believes that there's something going on. But he would definitely say the Vatican knows something they're not telling us. Malachi Martin, a former Jesuit Catholic theologian, has written quite a bit about some conspiracies within the Catholic Church involving Satanism and things like that. But the interesting thing here is when he was on Coast to Coast in 1997, Art Bell asked him about why the Vatican was up there in Arizona, and he said, because the mentality amongst those who are at the highest levels of the Vatican administration and geopolitics know that what's going on in space and what's approaching us could be of great import within the next 5-10 years. So here we have, he was an advisor to 3 popes, and he's got 3 PhDs, really highly placed Vatican insider, and he's telling us that they're watching for something to come. Okay, that was his words. George Coignet, who was the board director when this thing went on board in 1993, 1992, he gave all these interviews in the press at the time and just said some astounding things. He said that they were teaming up with NASA to look for aliens to baptize them into the Catholic Church. Just really bizarre. I don't know if he was joking or not, but you can find this article online. And this was in 1993. So he's the first one that I'm aware of that began to talk about baptizing extraterrestrials, George Coignet. And then Consul Magno, who we interviewed in the book, he's got a book out right now. It just came out, Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial? But he was talking about it back in 2010 and earlier even. Would you baptize an extraterrestrial? Only if it asks, but no matter how many tentacles it had. That's what he said. And he's got a brand new book out that's out right now. It's going up the top of the bestseller list, I think. Would you baptize an extraterrestrial? The same guy. Now this is a guy who, Monsignor Corrado Balducci, this is in the late 90s. He went out and gave all these interviews. Now, Monsignor is an honorary title that has to be given to you by the Pope. He was really the demonologist and the exorcist for the Diocese of Rome. So here's a guy who's supposed to be, the expert on demons, on exorcism, for really the heart of the Roman Catholic religion. Now he went out in the press. This is on Italian television, so it's going to be in Italian, but it has captions. Now he said some astounding things. He was talking mainly about the UFO phenomenon, but he believed that the aliens were already here and said so in public. Oh. Let's see if I can get the video to play.
Padre Balduzzi, allora, lei che cosa risponderebbe a quanti sostengono che gli alieni sono già fra di noi?
Non si può più pensare è vero, non è vero, sono veri o sono falsità, ci si crede o non ci si crede, no. Oramai ci sono varie considerazioni che fanno dire con certezza che l'esistenza di questi esseri c'è, non si può dubitare.
We can't have doubts. The existence of these beings is real. So, what are we to make of such a highly placed, influential insider going on national television in Italy and saying nowadays there are several considerations that allow us to say with assurance that the existence of these beings is real? So, we're not making this stuff up. This is right out of their own mouths. They can't really just say he's a loose cannon or something, because he really has the title Monsignor, and he's out speaking for the church in public. And he was speaking at UFO conferences and all this sort of stuff, saying that he wanted to be the ambassador for the Space Brothers to the UFO community. Really bizarre. Here's a recent documentary that Stephen Greer, kind of one of the UFO people, has put out. It was called Sirius. But here's a quote, I just took a screenshot, where he's saying the aliens are far superior to us. So he really did believe this and taught it publicly. That there were superior extraterrestrials coming to Earth. And just in this few months ago, Pope Francis is the first pope I'm aware of to start talking about baptizing extraterrestrials into the Catholic Church. Okay, what do you do with that? It kind of sounded like he had a tongue-in-cheek kind of joke, maybe, but I mean, you would think that, except there's been so many of them who have said it. I've cataloged at least 4 of the top astronomers who have talked about baptizing extraterrestrials into the church, and now you have the Pope saying it. Okay, so I don't know. Are they joking, or is it tongue-in-cheek? I think there's something up. I don't really know what to do with it exactly, but you have these high-level insiders talking about this is real. In the last probably 4 or 5 weeks, Guy Consolmagno, the fellow I just showed you, has gone out in the press and said the existence of extraterrestrial life, the discovery of it is inevitable, okay? It's not a matter of if, it's when. And he's really basing that on those assumptions that I showed you that really aren't consistent with a theistic worldview. But, this isn't just something that we cooked up, is what I wanted to show. There's a lot of evidence that they really are interested in this. They really do seem to know something that they're not saying, but they're parsing it in a real scientific, publicly acceptable way, except that you see these little things coming out. What is up with the Fatima thing? It sounds like a UFO. And so there's all this interesting information coming together. Now, how does this fit into prophecy? Well, just in closing, what would unite the world really fast? What would bring Buddhists and Catholics and fundamentalists and atheists? What would unite everybody really quickly on the earth? Something from outside the earth, okay? Now, Ronald Reagan said this in many of his speeches, that if we were faced with an alien threat, how quickly we would all come together to defend the earth. Well, it wouldn't necessarily have to be a threat. In my thinking, what if there's some really powerful evidence that life on Earth was created from space? Wouldn't that unite everybody in a way that Michael Heiser was talking about, towards some sort of global acknowledgement of that fact? So when we see, Bible prophecies of one world religion, a one world leader, one world government, one thing that could make that happen almost overnight would be something that transcends the Earth, coming towards the Earth. So I don't know if this plays into Bible prophecy or not. But what I'm suggesting to you is that a lot of the things that look like it would take a long time to happen could happen really quick if something came from above. And that's really why I think it's a fascinating subject. And there's so much stuff about it, in the media, in the movies. It's like we've been prepared for it, for generations. So for that reason, I think it's a compelling idea, and it's something we should pay attention to at least. And I thank you for your time very much.